And welcome to Delightful Dissent. It's episode 41, and today on the show we've got Mart Gordon joining us. Thank you very much for joining us, Mart.
Hello, thank you.
Mart's a creativity consultant and facilitator, and we're going to be talking about the assumption you are what you do. So this is a really interesting one because I often feel like that natural response to that question, like "What are you?" which is a weird question that people kind of ask in social questions. Yeah, the response is to tell people what your job is, or it's certainly that's what's expected. I because I don't really have a good description for my job, certainly that makes sense to people in those kind of small talky situations. And even conventional jobs don't. It doesn't really tell you very much about the person. So I think this is a really, really interesting one to get into for all sorts of reasons. If you happen to be new to Delightful Dissent, though, this show came up through my work with people who are taking a different approach to things and making their own way. Mart's very much one of those people. But I found this work can often really have hit these barriers, these hidden barriers that are really around the implicit belief, the unexamined assumptions that underpin stuff. And the show's a bit about challenging some of those. So I hope it will give you specific ideas and about a specific thing that you can maybe think about differently. But perhaps more importantly, it will give you some ideas about the assumptions that you can go out there and challenge yourself. Because I'd really like to see everyone doing that. I'd also like to see everyone get comfortable really exploring this stuff, and it not being this thing that has to be hidden away. So the show's called Delightful Dissent because, yeah, we're going to challenge some ideas and think about things in a slightly different way. But it's not about proving ourselves right at everyone else's expense. It's about understanding the context and seeing things from a different angle, but accepting that maybe sometimes the conventional angle is the right one as well. The show is genuinely live. We might talk about challenging topics, and we might also use strong language. So if either of those are a concern for you, then please be aware. There aren't any perfect answers here. It's very much an exploration of what could be. It's all about asking questions of yourself and of us. So if you're watching live, please do ask us questions in the chat, and we might well be able to bring them in and answer them live. If you're watching the recording, we'll be sharing information about how you can get in touch with either of us at the end of the show. So, yeah, I've known Mart for a good few years now, actually, and we've always kind of wanted to collaborate on something. I think, well, I certainly always have wanted to collaborate on something with you, and we've never quite kind of landed on anything in particular. But for me, part of the reason I wanted to do that and I wanted to get Mart on the show is because he's really a genuinely original thinker, with in quite a strikes you first when we first talked. It really struck me as quite quiet and unassuming, but there's a really quick, quite sharp wit along with that I really enjoy. So it's a really interesting combination, and I think it's a really interesting one, particularly to bring into this kind of context around this combination of the personal and the professional. So yeah, that's probably enough of me talking though. So could I ask you to describe a little bit about what you do and the kind of people that you like to work with, please?
Well, yeah, the interesting thing you said at the start of this is how difficult you find it to describe to people what you do. There isn't really that easily settled on title that describes or encapsulates what you do. And I'm very much in the same boat. In fact, I do a number of different things. So, I work as a designer. I do some coding as well. I'm originally a trained sound engineer and worked in the music industry. And I now also teach and lecture at the Liverpool Institute for Performing Arts. So I have a number of different avenues I go down. But the main thing that I really enjoy is working with organizations, teams, or even individuals to help them figure out ways that they can be more creative generally, problem solve for themselves, I'm a big believer that if there's a problem within a system, the answer, the truest answer, the answer that's really, really going to work, can be found within that system. So, for example, if you have a problem within your organization, that you need to figure out what the problem is, looking for the answer externally may not be the best solution. There's people within the organization who have really good ideas that just haven't been heard yet. And sometimes those people don't know they have the ideas yet. And that's where I come in. I like to help some of those things happen, whether they're collaborative processes, whether it's a communication problem, whether it's an innovation problem. And I use a lot of playful techniques to do that, whether it's Lego serious play, the applied improv, or some game storming. Use a lot of different techniques, but the constant within that is play. And I think the play element is because that's where I feel comfortable in exploring myself as well as the outside world. And so I think it's a personal and professional connection there.
Thank you. And what was it that kind of brought you to this particular approach to things?
A number of things, I think. For one of the things that I've always pursued is that I find work to be the work that I'm doing to be at its most engaging when I find something fun within it, and when I can use play within work, and I can facilitate for organisations, whether it's universities, which I've done stuff with universities in the past, or teams within the NHS, or I did something for the government internal audit agency as well a few years back, which that was an interesting thing to bring play and divergent thinking to people who are essentially all going to be trained accountants and so on. So they have a very sort of systems-based looking at outlook on the world. So trying to bring some play into that system was an interesting concept for them. So I've lost the thread of the question there, which is one of my traits.
Yeah, it was how you came to kind of doing to this particular thing.
So yeah, looking for the fun in things really proved to me that actually when you find play, or when you use playful techniques to problem solve or to aid collaboration in teams, you get to the kind of objective in a way that's really difficult to do when you're sat around a table having a meeting. And so you can kind of cover a much more divergent landscape really relatively quickly, and then converge on an idea. And for me, when ideas, I've always been consumed with wanting to know where ideas come from, whether it's like the idea for a song. I've always been a frustrated songwriter, one that's just won't sit down and write a song. And so I think when where the idea comes from for a song, a story, a product, a service, sometimes these things seem so genius, or sometimes they seem so obvious that you think, why hasn't anyone done this before? So what was the process of that idea coming about? And so that's where I really got into these sorts of things. So the idea was something I was always chasing. And I wanted to know how people had better ideas and were able to better problem solve. And I just found that some of these techniques, like Lego serious play, is an incredibly powerful one. but it takes some real discipline to go through the application processes. Whereas there are some looser versions, but they all have a certain amount of structure. And so I think that I found these playful structures to be useful was kind of how I came into this. Always looking for that creative idea, whether it's problem solving, whether it's collaboration, whether it's communication.
Thank you. Yeah, a lot of that really resonates for me, I think, particularly the finding. I have a kind of knee-jerk reaction to structure, which is don't like it. Because it's limited, because I kind of think of it as limiting and think of it as annoying and getting in the way. And actually, I have, from my own experience, starting to find what is a helpful structure. What's a structure that enables more exploration, more fun, and make it easier to do that. I think the difficulty with it when you're kind of starting completely from scratch every time is that's a huge amount of stuff to do. It's too much.
Yeah.
And you don't have the energy to then do what you want to do in the space. And also relatedly, I think, thinking about energy and I have a very limited capacity to engage with anything as a means to an end. I can only really pay attention and engage with something that is intrinsically interesting.
Yeah, I fully understand that, and that's why for me, an element of playfulness makes it intrinsically interesting. You've brought to mind like a knee-jerk reaction to structure, kind of similar history to me in that case, which is why I kind of went down various different routes when I first started moving from adolescence into adulthood. I didn't take a traditional approach to education. I did end up going to a higher education establishment and gaining a degree, but I started out on various different tracks and ended up going there over a long number of years, rather than the usual 3 years. And because of that sort of knee-jerk reaction, once I started finding playful ways of doing things because they are, as you said, intrinsically interesting, I started searching more and more of them out, which is how I ended up falling in love with Lego Serious Play, which is incredibly powerful if you are able to give it the time and the investment it needs. But even if you've got short amounts and short periods of time, there are processes and exercises and games you can play that tend to build up a muscle of collaboration, for example, of listening skills, whatever it might be, through the applied improv. And then when you're looking to create more meaningful, interesting meeting spaces, the stuff that I've found with the liberating structures, I just think, it's like at first you think it might be like doing something with the training wheels on, but it's not. The structure is like a shortcut through the forest. You still end up with all of the gains, but and in fact sometimes even more of the gains, because you allow the divergence of thought from the multitude of people you bring into that structure to come out, and that structure allows you to get to that end product and through the forest quicker, but with more productivity out of it.
And I think more importantly, more enjoyable. As importantly, more enjoyable. It's a more enjoyable process. I think one of the interesting things about I'm really interested in this relationship between our emotional sense of the world and the kind of rational sense of the world. And I don't necessarily see the rational sense as having primacy in the way that some other people do. So I'm really interested in when those two things don't line up. It's like, what if So why are we doing something that makes rational sense but we don't enjoy? Because for me, enjoyment is a very strong marker of whether something's actually worthwhile on some level. There's something that's the sense of the systemic value of the thing.
Mm.
It's like, is this really valuable? Or am I just doing, so I think it's a really interesting thing, when you find this, when you find yourself working in a place that, or in a way that's really not enjoyable, it's hard and unpleasant.
Mm.
Is there For me, it's actually it's a really interesting question to ask. Well, why are we approaching this way? Is it going to give us something that we want, or is there actually a different way to approach it?
Yeah, I think this is very true, and it's it's like approaching the world with blinkers on in certain respects, so we don't see the wider picture, or the interesting opportunities that are out there. And I think by doing so, we've come to this idea that efficiency is the unique goal of business, but it's not, because we could be efficient in our processes, but not particularly effective in our output. And it's that trading away our effectiveness in the pursuit of efficiency that I think causes some problems.
Yeah, absolutely. For me, I very much I use exactly the same language, and that situation of kind of diminishing returns very often, where something was useful but is no longer useful, is a
Yeah,
really really tough thing for organizations to move past. I one of my favorite stories is is looking for the keys where the lights are.
yes,
This thing about, like, well, so you come across a person searching for their keys under the streetlights. What's happened? I dropped my keys, so I'm looking for them. It's like, would you know where you dropped them? Yeah, I dropped them over there in the bushes. So why are you looking for them here? Well, the light's better here. It really is that.
mm,
That for me sums up what actually an awful lot of organizations are fundamentally doing. Is they're looking for their keys where the light's good, not where the keys are.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I do love that story. That's a brilliant one.
Yeah. So before we go too much, I do like to kind of bring in a quote, if you've got something you'd like to share with us, to kind of give us a bit of a perspective on
Well, sure.
whatever.
I love a good quote, and there are infinitely good quotes out there of various different types. One of my favorites is from Miles Davis, that if anybody wants to keep creating, they have to be all about change, which I think is a brilliant quote. But that's not the one I brought in, so I've managed to sneak in a sneaky one there. But the one I've brought in for today is from T.S. Eliot, from Four Quartets, and the quote is, "We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all of our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time." And that quote, I think, encapsulates having that exploratory mindset, because I think one of the things I've realized when I was younger, and probably schooling really put me into this mindset, and I think it's a failing of the way we educate generally children, is that we go down this route of telling them, everybody, how everything it should be done, and it's a pursuit of efficiency over effectiveness. Whereas the more I've started playing with things, and looking for where ideas come from, and investigating divergent thinking, I now see more opportunity, and I see the world as though I've got better lenses in, and I can see, actually, this is all fresh to me, and I can see it with that fresh perspective, which is a really lovely thing to be able to do, to know that my perspective um, is much fresher, allows me to then to spot more opportunities that would usually go missing, um, because I'm blinkered, and I'm looking for the efficient route.
I think I really like that relationship, I think it relates so well to this idea of you are what you do, and the
Mm.
putting something in a neat box,
Yes.
and if we apply it, it's fairly silly applied to really simple objects, like in the sense of like, well, I'm sure everyone has used, say, cutlery for all sorts of things that it wasn't intended. Like, the number of knives in my drawer that have also been used as a screwdriver
Yeah.
or whatever.
Opening a tin of paint and
Uh,
all those sorts of things. Yeah.
exactly. So it's even for a relatively straightforward object, it's pretty, it's trivial. It's not a
Mm.
safe statement. There are other ways, but when we're talking about something as multifaceted and complex as a person,
Mm.
the idea that we kind of do this and also do the same thing in every circumstance.
Mm.
So I think this is the other part of it. So much of this is really about context, and I really like the fact in your quote. It's that you're somehow in the same place, but things have changed.
Mm.
Which is about a shift in context on some level.
Yeah, I think it's also about being able to focus, so that we can open the aperture and have a much wider focus. I don't know if you've ever seen the work of, I don't know if it's his experiment. I just know his book, that he writes about it. Dr. Richard Wiseman wrote a book called, "Did You Spot the Gorilla?" And it's based on. I don't think it is his experiment. I'm sure it's an experiment from like 2001 or something from a couple of American guys, and they asked people in a select audience to count the number of passes in this baseball game they were showing. So they showed I don't know, 3-minute, 4-minute clip of some baseball, and you had to count basketball. Sorry, you had to count the number of passes, and so people were coming up with various different numbers for the number of passes, and the conversation carried on, and the people the scientists who'd set this experiment said, so is there anything else you want to comment on of the video you saw? And nobody really did, or very, very few people did. And it turned out there's a guy in a gorilla suit who comes on halfway through and waves at the camera. And because people were so focused on the task of spotting these or counting these passes, they didn't spot that gorilla. And I find that absolutely incredible that we have these blind spots and we build them into ourselves, because that blind spot wouldn't have been there if they hadn't been told to count passes. I'm fairly sure, and I imagine in the experiment they did it without giving people the focus of counting passes, and a higher percentage of people, if not everybody, would have spotted that gorilla, because it comes on at the waves of the camera. It's not like they try to hide it.
It's such a it's one of those experiments that kind of makes you laugh and slightly disturbed at the same time.
Mm.
You're like,
The interesting thing is that it's quite obvious in that sense, because of that experiment of how we built a kind of conscious bias into ourselves by focusing on that one thing to the detriment of everything else. But what about all those unconscious biases that we haven't built into ourselves, that are just built in over time, that we haven't ever spotted? Because they're all gorillas as well that we haven't actually spotted about ourselves, that is not allowing us to spot other opportunities.
I think there's something really interesting in that. There's a concept from psychology experiments called demand characteristics, which essentially are that the way that the things that you ask for and the way that you ask constrain behavior in specific ways. There's almost an experiment on some level into how those play out.
Mm.
And one of the really interesting things you touched on earlier is essentially that you can develop the skill to kind of explore and play. It's not, I think you described it as a muscle that you can build, and I really like that. But I really think a part of that for me feels like the play with others.
Yes.
there's actually some skills involved in opening up the field, or not, but also not opening it too far, because that becomes overwhelming, and kind of working with people and building upon ideas or tangenting off ideas, rather than either continuing them in a very linear way or
Mm.
kind of stopping them dead. And also in allowing that those things might also be a good way to play, and might actually be a fun thing to do. But
Mm.
yeah, I think it's really interesting to think about the other side, the kind of questions that we ask, and building that capacity to step outside of our own frame of reference a bit, and to see, like, because for me it's like, but there are always, just like you say, there are always this implicit frame.
Mm.
Like, what are we doing here? And actually, it's good that it's limiting, because limits are what actually we need. Some limits. We can't just do everything from first principles. But
Mm.
there's a question about whether they're good limits, whether they're what we want to, whether they're the perspective we want to take.
Yeah. I think within the improv world, you've obviously got this key element of improv being yes and. I did a workshop yesterday with a company called Playfield, that I was co-presenting with them. They're a lovely company. So we did this workshop, and we used quite a bit of yes and within the workshop. And so we're running this exercise, and we start off with the same idea with all the different groups, and they went off into breakout rooms, and when they came back to debrief, we heard some different stories of what happened. And the idea was that you start out having a conversation about a friend who isn't present at the moment, but for all people in the group in the breakout room, this is a common friend, and you are just going to use the structure of yes and as you go around the group talking about this person. So you might start off with Ashley is settling into the team really well, and so the next person would say, yes, she is settling into the team really well, and she makes great coffee, and this can carry on and on. And so they were all kind of starting from that same position of somebody settling into the team really well. But some of them went off into different tangents, looking at who this person was on a personal level. Some of them carried on looking at them in how they fit into the team. And there was one group there that had this person going down a fairly dark route, and being best friends with Donald Trump, which irrespective of how you feel about Donald Trump, but it's kind of very out of the box, and I wouldn't have seen that one coming. But the interesting thing is that they're always sparking off of each other's idea and just building on it, and I think that's a really kind of powerful concept for people to play around with. And the exercise that we did yesterday, they were only at it for 3 to 5 minutes, somewhere like in that region, and they came back and we debriefed. But it's now an exercise that they can use whenever they're about to start meeting, just as a kind of little exercise to do every morning when they're going to do their daily stand-ups for whatever sprint they're working on, or whatever it might be. And I think the interesting thing for it is that the more they do it, the more they'll be able to spark off of each other's ideas by building that muscle and not letting it atrophy, because these things aren't considered work, so we don't usually do them. But if we bring them into our work and we continue to do them, we build up that muscle, and we start to use it much more. And I've seen it myself, since I've started doing improv much more regularly. I now am part of an improv team. Even my home life is much less. There's much less friction and much less conflict, um, within even my home life. So it comes from a place of flexing those muscles. So those muscles of listening, because it's hard to build a reality out of nothing when it's all unscripted, unless you listen to what the other people are saying. Because if you're all talking at different on different lines, we're all going in different directions, and that doesn't build any kind of reality. So I think it's key to kind of train yourself in these different things, and playful ways of training are much more fun to do from my perspective, and we can make them purposeful.
I think it's a really interesting thing, and there's one of the themes that's cropped up on the show a couple of times is this idea of play as kind of slightly trivial, whereas actually, I don't think it ever is. Partly because we see play throughout large parts of the animal kingdom, and evolution isn't famous for things that don't have a function. For selecting for things that don't actually have a direct, don't have a benefit. So if we see a lot of creatures playing, it suggests that there's value in play, significant value in play.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Did you ever come across the book Feck Perfection?
No, no,
It's
I
a
want to read
really
it now.
interesting book. It's fun, but it's there's one element of it where the author's talking about play, and I forget who the author is. I want to say Victoire, but I can't remember off the top of my head. He's talking about play, and he says the interesting thing about play is that it can be incredibly serious. But he says anything we do at work, when we're creating, because the whole book's really dedicated to creativity. Anything we do, there is a subjective and an objective element to it, and we focus on the objective, but the subjective is what makes it creative, what makes it special. So here I seem to remember the example given in the book is, if you're a chef, the objective is to put good edible food onto the table. Well, that's relatively simple as an objective, but what makes it subjective is when a chef starts playing, and Heston Blumenthal didn't become one of the most famous chefs in the country by not playing with his food. Some of this stuff that he's put together, like the snail porridge and so on, it's through an act of play that he's come up with that, and he's playing around with it, and the number of iterations he goes through to perfect it are also an act of play. So I think it's when we add the subjective elements back in that we can make ourselves original, we can make ourselves stand out from the crowd, and we can make ourselves able to bring some of that humanity back to work and back to ourselves as well, because we're lacking in it on levels of our business lives, our work lives, but we're also lacking in it on our social interactions from day to day as well.
It feels to me, I think there's something very interesting about this stuff and this real exploration of stuff. That it is on some level risky. Certainly it's consequential. I think there's always that fear of what's seen can't be unseen, and that there might be difficult things. And I think one of the interesting things that Heston Blumenthal's a really good example actually is these contradictory things. Is the things that shouldn't go together. And I think it plays really nicely with what we're doing. You are what you do. It's like, well, okay, I'm a mass of these things, some of which are apparently contradictory. So what is it? And I think that on some level, those kind of paradoxical things are both there's something quite scary in them, but there's also something very exciting in them.
Mm.
They're on some level they're narrative tension. They're the setup for a punchline as well.
Yeah.
It's without tension, without narrative tension, you don't have a joke.
Yes.
And it's the joyful resolution of an apparent paradox that feels
Mm.
like actually on some level what that is, and on some level I think that also feels like innovation. Okay, so we've got these kind of weirdly paradoxical situations. We've got this thing and that thing. These things don't quite make sense. Okay, we found a route through. We
Mm.
found something else, a direct link. And it feels like actually being able to play with those things is probably the only, I think they are unpredictable because they are outside of our normal experience.
Mm.
And I think it's very often by the combining of different apparently contradictory perspectives in that way that we kind of we do that. It feels like very much a joint act. It's a co-created
Mm.
thing, that we because we need a perspective to bounce off. And I think certainly for me, I experience myself as having quite a different perspective to most people.
Yeah.
um and most of the people I work with do have they have like consistently profoundly different way of experiencing the world on some level to most people around them. um and interestingly, I think a lot of them do then pick up this ability to play with that simply out of because that's how you stay safe. That's why lots of
Mm.
people who are like this end up being jokers or end up being kind of like working in innovation. You've got to express it somehow, because
Yeah.
it drives you mad. And that kind of slightly unexpected creativity is on one level is really satisfying, but I think on another level is quite disturbing. It's quite difficult for people, and
Yeah.
I think
I think you're
play
right.
play does keep that safer
Mm.
somehow.
Yeah. With the risk of it, to a certain extent, it becomes about managing our own risk levels and what we're happy with. And I think I find those that are happier to take bigger risks can end up being the most successful. Risk of go for another Miles Davis quote. He said that if you play a wrong note, it's the next note you play that discovers whether it was good or bad. And so it's that risk of failure, that risk that we take. There is the next step is whether that risk and that potential failure actually becomes something even better. And I notice this all the time, especially when doing improv. Some of the best sort of improv and funniest scenes are when people really commit to stuff that's gone properly wrong. And some of the kind of world famous improv teachers I've taken courses with in the past, the constant refrain I often hear is, commit to it, commit to the shit is the thing, and I think it's an incredible mindset to get into if you realize that something's gone wrong here. If you commit to it and if you own it rather than trying to hide it away, in a Nick Leeson style, and you end up taking down Baring's Bank, it's more a case of commit to it, own it, get out in the open, in the daylight, see what can be made out of this. At the very least, I think the more people's eyes you get on a problem that you've risked everything with, then allows for a recovery, at the very least, or it could allow for something absolutely incredible to happen. And so that's
Mm.
where risk is. I'm quite an optimist, so I like risk in certain respects. I'm not particularly financially risky, but I am sort of risky with experiences and so on. I like to risk looking stupid, and
It's
for me,
it's
Go on.
Yeah, it's funny. So risk is an interesting word for me, and
Mm,
I know before the show we talked about like the language, how language allows you to approach things in a certain way and constrains you another way. And
yeah,
for me, risk is an interesting concept because for me, risk means something where I can work out the odds.
yeah,
Where the odds are knowable. And I think that's actually quite we talk about a lot of situations where we can't really discern risk at
mm,
all. It's not actually possible for us to know like what are the it's not gambling where you've got fixed odds
mm,
is an example of risk.
yeah,
um because that's but what we're actually talking about is uncertainty.
mm,
um and I find I actually have they're weirdly I think the conflation is really interesting because it does certain things because
yeah,
I experience myself as actually having quite a low risk appetite for known odds if there's certainty involved. But uncertainty, I love uncertainty. I
mm,
love because another word for uncertainty is possibility
yeah. Or opportunity,
or opportunity. Yeah,
it's kind of applied uncertainty.
exactly. And I think that relationship is a really interesting one, and understanding a lot of this is actually it's very much about understanding your own, and it's not that one is right and one is wrong,
Mm,
but it's about understanding which you enjoy.
yes.
Because a lot of people love to play with risk, and that's great. They tend to be good in those kind of they make very good stock traders, for example.
Mm,
But those of us who play with prefer uncertainty tend to work in a slightly different way and with different systems
yeah.
and in different ways. And I think for me, it's actually it's a really good example of the sometimes we kind of lump words together. This surface things are similar or things are the same, and therefore
Yeah.
everything's the same, or they're completely different and they're completely opposites. And the weird thing is they have some things in common, but they're also different. And
Mm, yeah.
that's a difficult thing to capture and to be with and to dig into, I think,
Yeah.
sometimes.
Yeah. I agree with that. I think the one of the big problems with both risk and uncertainty is how systemically we are kind of creating systems that um, shun and both love both those concepts. So, for example, if you take a big risk, like I mentioned Nick Leeson earlier, and you lose everything and end up taking down 150-year-old bank or whatever it was in the process by taking a massive risk, you are shunned by society, and and that's the way the system is kind of set up. Um, Whereas if he took that risk and everything went really well, he would be loved and held up as a kind of hero rather than a pariah. So I think systemically, how we deal with these different things is interesting because we look at it from the systemic point of view of hindsight. We only judge these things in hindsight. We don't judge the processes that got us to that point. Um,
I
and
really like
sorry.
it makes me think about that actually when we say you are what you do,
Mm,
quite a lot of the assumption is actually you are what you did.
mm,
Yeah, and I think it's what comes up for me in that is very often we have a bias towards kind of the intrinsic consequence, the intrinsic state of a person being the reason that they acted in that way,
mm,
instead of looking to the system. And it lets the system off in many ways. It prevents us from revising things that are that would be better revised. I think of very often the people that get the blame are actually effectively the canary. It's like blaming the canary for dying. It's like, okay, well, the canary died, and therefore all the miners died.
Yeah.
And actually, what we're saying, it's a bit like saying, well, the miners died because the canary died. It's
Yeah.
instead of looking at the underlying and the
Mm.
systems and the situation, the context in
Yeah.
which it arises.
Well, you see this often with problem solving expeditions or problem solving kind of work that we put in. For a lot of people, problem solving is really symptoms sort of relieving. And so they don't take that risk of looking further upstream to see what the actual problem is. In fact, upstream is the right word, because there's a really good book on this by Dan Heath. It's one he wrote on his own, but usually he writes with his brother Chip Heath, I think it is. And so they wrote the book Made to Stick together, and a couple of other ones that I've read. Their books are generally really well set out with a lot of story, and story really is my thing. If I want to understand something, if somebody can put a story on top of it, then I'm going to get it. I'm going to understand it. If it's not dealing with a story, I might struggle. But his book Upstream really talks about this, and how by taking that risk of looking where the problem occurs further upstream, you can actually solve the problem and find a solution to what is the underlying problem, rather than just relieving symptoms. And
I think
when
very often we look to the immediate thing and assume and give that all of the cause.
Yeah.
It's like, and on some level, it's an artifact of the scientific method. And I consider myself a scientist in many ways, and I think it's an incredibly useful method. But one of the consequences that comes out of that approach of isolating everything is we can overvalue the cause in an isolated context, and then generalize something that's specific to a context beyond its use. And I think how we generalize is actually one of the really interesting questions around this. And maybe on some level, actually thinking about it with play, what we're actually doing is it's a way of trying on generalizations, aspects of identity, models, is like, and seeing whether they fit. And it's actually a very difficult thing to do in the like purely in imagination, I find personally. I need to be in the situation. It needs a certain degree of reality for me to be able to actually engage with it.
Yeah.
But this kind of ability to try different models feels like a really big part of the value of this, but also of the kind of the way it can really disturb the existing order of things. And I think that's often the challenge, really. There's a degree of disturbance in this. It's there is often unwelcome, actually. And I think it's interesting how play is like it makes me think of the Puck's speech at the end of Midsummer Night's Dream, Shakespeare. If we shadows have offended, think but this, and all is mended. It's this idea that, okay, well, it's just it's just a play. It's just imaginary. It's not real.
Yeah.
If it's too much for you, it's just a joke.
Yeah.
And I think it's a really interesting thing to be able to do that, and that's as a kind of safety valve for doing some stuff that's actually potentially really challenging, really threatening. That you wouldn't be able to do otherwise.
Yeah, you're right with that. There's something you've mentioned there that about with the scientific method, kind of contextualizing us or contextualizing something to that degree that that we fail to be able to generalize again, is very similar to how we with the topic of you are what you do, we tend to kind of go down that route of really contextualizing ourselves by what we do, to the point where people don't see us as anything else. If we say we are this and we act like we do this, then people are going to find it hard to figure out that you fit into another box as well. I'm brought to mind of a meeting I was in years ago now for a client. I was looking at the design of their whole stable of online websites and various channels. And so I was working with their marketing department. So we were looking at the sort of next iteration of what they were going to do. It's for a film production company, but also this film production company, one of the bigger parts of their work is they run film schools in this country and in Germany. And during this process, it was only the marketing company, the marketing team that were there because they were the creative thinkers. And we were bogged down in this conversation, the topic for a good long time. And the chief executive was in the meeting as well. And so that obviously brought its own dynamic, but that's a side point. But because he was in the meeting, the financial director needed sign off on something. So he just popped his head around the door. And I said, have you got 5 minutes? Came and explained what we were talking about to this financial director. And he brought up this whole list of things that we need to consider that nobody in the room had got. And so therefore said, okay, I can see what you're saying with this. And he said, but if you consider this part, then it can become this, and which made a completely different idea out of something that could actually then start to work, and sparked us into the next iteration of, or next set of conversations to be had. And I really liked that, because I really liked that everyone saw him as a financial silo. That's his world over there. But I brought him into the creative element, and he completely changed the world for everybody in that meeting we were having. And I think that is because he was allowed to be slightly redefined and be outside of what he does, because what he does was defined in everybody's mind as, you just do this.
Yeah, it's funny. It really, it's so much of this applies on a personal and organizational level, and I think it feels like it's very easy to be defined kind of by almost by a closing off, by a like what do we manage, what do we reduce in the world,
Yeah.
instead of what do we actually bring about, what are we creating, what are we bringing into the world, and the kind of the what we do is so often just a vehicle for something greater, something more meaningful, something that's meaningful, and something very different, rather than it being this kind of like, okay, I just do this because.
Yeah.
And I think it's very interesting to be able to break outside of, once you step outside of that, it opens up so many different opportunities. And it also, I think it prevents you from ending up in this space of diminishing returns. So many companies expire because they end up with a business model that's no longer that's no longer valid. I mean, the obvious examples are Blockbuster and Kodak.
Yeah.
And you're like, well, there was this, they had ample opportunity to do this. And it's actually a question of perspective. It's this self-reinforcing thing, and seeing yourself as a company, like, we do this. It's like, well, no, we actually, there's something bigger than that,
Yeah.
and being able to step outside, look at the upstream stuff, and allows you into that space. I think perhaps the difficulty is it's never going to be deterministic. It's never going to be a sure 100% thing. And I
Yeah.
think that's why the play and the exploration, the okay, we'll try this, but we're not going all in on it,
Yeah.
is such a helpful way to engage with this stuff.
Well, fundamentally, it allows us to go from play allows us that experimental route to go from and look at what is and consider it as what if. And that route from what is to what if is really difficult. And I can't see a route of doing it without play, because we need to be able to figure it out. And we, like you said earlier, be able to try on those different clothes, and be able to try on all those different outfits. Because if we tell ourselves we're one thing all the time, then that's all we will ever be. You know, and it's a case in point for people who have been, you know, in an abusive relationship, whether it's a child and a parent or whatever it might be. You know, that if it was a child and a parent, and they're being told all the time that they're useless or they're rubbish or whatever, and they begin to internalize that and tell themselves that I'm useless and I'm rubbish, then they're only ever going to be useless or rubbish. So that needs to be broken out of. And it reminds me of a quote we spoke about earlier when we were talking about quotes from Lao Tzu, that you need to watch your words or watch your thoughts because they become your words, and watch your words because they become your actions, watch your actions because they become your habits, and watch your habits because what's the last bit of it? It becomes your character, isn't it? And then watch your character, it becomes your destiny. And so just from those internal thoughts about ourselves, the language we use about ourselves and about our systems and about our businesses, really have that rippling effect of the butterfly's wings in Peru setting off the hurricane in Japan or wherever it might be.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting one. So say someone is listening to this and kind of resonates with this and thinking, how should I start? Where should I begin? This is there's a lot of stuff we've covered off. So,
Yeah.
in a lot of different ways. So what would you say to someone who's literally like, okay, I'd like to try starting exploring this stuff. What can I do?
Well, for me, I'm a voracious reader, so I love to get things from books, and there's quite a few good books that allow us to kind of get into some of these things. There's a really good book if you kind of like almost little mini biographies of people who've gone this route and figured out what they want to do and different journeys into different things. Then Epiphany by Ken Robinson, I think, is an incredible book for that. And he tells one of the stories from Epiphany in his much lauded TED Talk, which I still think is one of the most, or if not the most, watched TED Talk in history, about the I'm going to have to look up her name, but there's the choreographer of Cats. Bear with me while I look up her name because I don't want to do her a disservice. Gillian Lynn, that's it. And he tells a story about her schooling that she told him. And so Gillian Lynn said that at school, she wasn't achieving much. She wasn't a standout student. Her teachers have been telling her parents that we should send her to a child psychologist to find out what's wrong with her, because they considered there was something wrong with her. So I'm guessing this was probably back in the 50s, maybe. And so she went to see this child psychologist with her mother, and the three of them chatted for a while. The psychologist chatted to Gillian Lynn herself. And then he said to her mother, "Can I have a quick word with you outside?" And as he went out, he switched the radio on, put some music on, and left the door ajar as they went outside. And he just said to the mother as they got outside the room, "Look back and see what she's doing." And Gillian was up there dancing. And he said to the mother, your child's not stupid. She's just a dancer. And it's an interesting concept for me that that there are those people who need to be able to move in order to be able to think. My nephew is one of them. In his school in America, they figured this out pretty quickly, and they gave him a desk on his own at the back of the class, so that when the teacher was talking and he was having to take in what the teacher and what the lecture of that lesson was going to be about, he was able to stand up and just pace up and down at the back of the class. And I just, that's a brilliant understanding that we all learn and think in different ways. There's a book by Stuart Brown, MD, called Play, and in that he sort of signifies the different play personas that we generally fall into, and we'll generally have quite a mix of them, but there's usually one that stands out more than others as our preferred play persona. And so when we're playing, that might be a persona that's based on the Joker. The storyteller is obviously one of the ones that I really resonate with. But there's also the kinesthetic player, the mover. And that's the person that Gillian Lynn is. But it's by accepting that we're not all the same. We're not all going to think in the same sort of patterns and the same ways. And we actually need to be able to express our thoughts in different ways, whether that's exploring, whether it's creatively by painting or whatever your creative pursuit might be, or whether it's by sport or anything like that, or just kinesthetically, so that you're moving, or that you're able to make jokes and bring levity to a situation. These are all ways of dealing with how our thoughts are affecting us. And I think that there's some investigation that we all need to do into that, and really understand that we're a mix of these different play personas and these different ways of thinking and these different ways of being. And that means that what we do might not be what we want to do, but we haven't investigated it enough yet.
I really like that. It's a wonderful place to kind of, wrap that up. I think giving oneself the opportunity to explore that is such a powerful thing. And I think for me, there's kind of some assumption in the back of my head anyway that might be quite a selfish thing to do. And actually what I'm coming to realize is but this is how you express the things that are of most value to others as well. So it's not selfish in that way. It's actually how you help others to your greatest ability.
Yeah, because without Gillian Lynn just wanting to move all the time, we wouldn't have ended up with some of the amazing choreography that she's created in her career. And that's a gift to us all as well. And it can be the same for various other. I mean, it's very easy to see with artists and sports people how their thinking and their dedication, because of the way they think, brings about these different elements. So I live near Liverpool, so obviously there's four lads whose shadow looms largely over this city, and the creative processes that they allow themselves to explore really has been a gift to the world, and it feels initially like it's a sort of self-exploration, but I think any sense of purpose needs to start off inside us. It needs to start off with that exploration of ourself, and then what we can bring out to the world.
Yeah, I really think that's a really lovely way to think about it, and a really lovely place to start, I think, if people find themselves stuck in that kind of question. Yeah, thank you. So if people want to get in touch with you or find out a little bit more about your work, what's the best way for them to do that?
Well, I have a website with some elements of my work encapsulated on it called mundonovus.com. But you can also find me, Martin Gordon, on LinkedIn. I'm also on Facebook, but I kind of see Facebook as a place for jokes and nonsense, whereas LinkedIn is obviously much more professional, and I treat Twitter as quite an interesting professional place as well. Strangely enough, I follow an awful lot of people in the advertising industry on Twitter, because I find the way they think really interesting to me, because a lot of the ways that they think, especially a guy called Dave Trott, who is an absolute legend in the advertising world, especially in the UK's version of the advertising world. He's he's still, to me, everything that I read of his and his blog posts and articles and so on feels like somebody who is holding everything lightly enough for it to be really considered play, and he's just investigating it.
It's really interesting. I think it's it brings home for me how how advertising is always a word very, very much about making money, and this idea that you can't kind of make a living being playful is such a shame. I think it's a really there's all sorts of positive ways to deploy this and help people. So yeah, thank you so much. I really enjoyed that. Really interesting conversation, and I think gives me I'm in the situation where I really want, there's a lot I'd like to kind of threads to follow up and continue with that, so hopefully we'll get the chance to revisit at some point.
You're welcome.
Thank you everyone in the audience for watching. It is your support that makes it possible. On some level, this show is just an excuse for me to talk to interesting people, but having people watch it does help with that excuse. So please do share it and let other people know if you think they might be helpful. You can find upcoming and past episodes on YouTube and LinkedIn, and you can find podcast episodes, though at this point they are a little bit behind, on your favorite podcast platform by searching Delightful Dissent. If you want to kind of explore some of this stuff yourself, you can find a bit more about my own work at divergentpathfinders.com. I really do hope this got you thinking, so do reach out and ask me on that at that website, or to Mart on his website, which is in the show notes. The next episode is going to be, I'm going to be talking to Sarah Kedge, who's business consultant, university lecturer, and neurodiversity advocate. And the topic we're going to be talking about is You Just Don't Understand, which I think is so appropriate in a really nice way for this as a follow-on from this one. I think I've really experienced being on both sides of this, regularly have this sense that I'm kind of listened to but not heard. And also I've really been met with it used to surprise me quite how much frustration and anger I've met when I've asked questions trying to understand. And I think actually kind of understanding some of that, and when we're talking about this today, and the way that some people find that almost threatening. So I'm really looking forward to kind of getting into this one a bit more and exploring some more of that. So that's going to be live at 1 p.m. UK time on Wednesday, the 8th of December. So in a couple of weeks' time. But yeah, in the meantime, I really do hope to see you then. But in the meantime, please do go out there and make some delightful dissent of your own. Thank you.
Thank you.